Are we on? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Michigan Detroit Center. I'm Luke Schaefer. I'm a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan and director of Poverty Solutions, a university-wide initiative that partners with communities and policymakers to bring evidence to find new ways to prevent and alleviate poverty. We're here to talk about the 2020 census. Hundreds of billions of dollars are allocated every year from the federal government to states and localities based on the census and annual estimates. Funding that goes to food and housing assistance, community development block grants, child care and early education, and many other essential programs. Accurately counting people is step one towards ensuring that people receive the support they need. When the 2020 census population counts came out for Detroit, we, like many others, were taken aback. The population decline reported by based on the Census Bureau 2019 estimates and the differential with the 2020 count was dramatic. And as we'll talk about today, we wanted to find out more. Through our Detroit Partnership on Economic Mobility, we have a strong partnership with the City of Detroit. We regularly work with city officials to bring evidence and data into the efforts to reduce poverty and promote economic mobility. Mayor Duggan asked us to look at the results of the census. And to me, what followed is a perfect example of partnership between the academy and government. I told the mayor we would do an independent analysis and that it might prove that he was wrong and the census count was correct. And he said if that were true, he would welcome it. To undertake our investigation, we enlisted world-class scholars from the University of Michigan. Ren Farley is a former president of the Population Association of America, the foremost association for scholars studying population counts. Lisa Neidert, one of our senior demographer scholars at the University of Michigan, and Jeff Mornoff, who you'll meet in a moment. They've been studying the census for years, and we brought them in to be our experts. We also enlisted Kurt Metzger, founder and director emeritus of Data Driven Detroit. Most importantly, we worked with our partners at Wayne State University's Center for Urban Studies, led by their director, Ramona Rodriguez-Washington, who's here with us. They conducted a door-to-door canvass in efforts through 5 Detroit block groups to attempt to verify the Census 2020 counts of total and occupied housing units, into depth about the report's findings. Jeff is a professor of sociology and public policy at the University of Michigan. He's an affiliate of Poverty Solutions and a former director of our Population Studies Center. And he's also one of the faculty lead directors of the Detroit Metro Area Community Study. He's going to hand it off to Mayor Mike Duggan, the mayor of the city of Detroit, and also a University of Michigan graduate. And then we're going to hear from Clovis Foster, a City of Detroit census captain and census enumerator, and Brenda Jett, a Detroit resident and census enumerator. We're going to go down that line. So I'm going to welcome Jeff to the podium.
Thank you, Luke. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. Let me just say that what brought this team together, and some of the people on this report, some of our co-authors are in the room, is a really deep sense of appreciation and long experience in both analyzing census data and also working, in the case of Ren Farley and Lisa Neidert and Kurt Metzger, for decades as census enumerators. So they really understand how the process works. They have a deep appreciation for the value of having accurate census data. And in the years and months leading up to the 2020 census, there were concerns about what might happen. There were concerns about underfunding of the Census Bureau, for example. There were concerns that there were new innovations being rolled out, such as internet self-response and expanded use of administrative records. And there were also concerns that those methods weren't being adequately tested. And that was all before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, and it made field operations even more difficult. So although there were warning signs on the horizon, I want to note that the city did everything in its power to try to protect against having an inaccurate census by making sure that the Census Bureau had an up-to-date and accurate list of housing units, first and foremost. But when we saw the results of the census count, and that's the first finding on this slide, and we saw that 31,000 people who were counted in the 2019 Census Bureau annual estimate of the population of Detroit were not counted in 2020, and that amounted to about a 5% drop in the population. As I'll show you later with a graph, that was a really off the trend line drop that was highly anomalous and frankly implausible, that the city's population could drop that much in a single year. So it made us very curious as academics. And the first step of that curiosity was to say, well, maybe this was an experience that other cities had too. You know, maybe it wasn't just Detroit. Maybe the 2020 census, maybe other cities saw such a rapid decline in their population. So we compared our estimates to those of other cities, and I'm going to show you those today, and we saw that there really are no comparisons to the experience that Detroit had. And then we said, okay, we need to really understand this more, and as Luke alluded to, we need to go out and collect data. And we decided to do two kinds of data collection. One of them was to send canvassers out into the field, which was run expertly by Ramona Washington, who's here at Wayne State, and to actually count housing units in a small number of neighborhoods. And I'll talk more about that work in just a second. And then we also marshaled other kinds of data, and the ones that I'm going to talk about today are from the United States Postal Service, to compare against both the census counts and the canvassing that we did. And when you put these three together, you get an audit of what the census counted, focusing on housing units. And the reason that we're focusing on housing units is that housing units form the backbone of two things, of the annual population estimates for cities like Detroit, and then also for the challenge procedure to correct possible inaccuracies in the census data. And it's also a lot easier to count housing than to count heads in housing, but we follow the census procedure to count the housing and then to estimate how many people that represents based on what we know about how many people are living in houses. So the third bullet point is the result of our audit study, and I'm going to dive into that right now, but I want to emphasize that what we found in these 10 neighborhoods that we studied was, in aggregate, that we estimate that this 2020 census undercounted the population and the number of housing units in those areas by 8.1%. And if you extrapolate that to the rest of the city, and if the rest of the city was undercounted at a similar rate, you would have a magnitude in the tens of thousands of people who were not counted. And I'll dive into that more in just a second. So here's the methodology, or there's a more extensive discussion of the methodology in the report that will be made available to you. But we selected two different sets of block groups. Block groups are one of the smallest units that the census uses to aggregate their data. And we first focused on a set of 5 neighborhoods that are historically very residentially stable neighborhoods with low rates of vacancy, high rates of owner occupancy, and high rates of people who have been living there for a long time. And when the census numbers began to come in, these were places that raised immediate red flags because it didn't seem at all possible that you would see vacancy rates jump up as high as they did in some of these areas. And I'm going to get into the specifics about what those areas are. So we sent the canvassers out to look at those areas first because, frankly, these are not areas that you would think would be hard to count in the census. These are the areas that would be amongst the easiest to count. And as Luke said, we wanted kind of proof of concept first and foremost. Like, can we go out there and verify that there was any evidence of an undercount? And if we didn't find it in these 5 neighborhoods, we weren't likely to find it in other places. So we went there and we found it. And then we decided to go beyond those 5 areas and look at places that have characteristics that are harder to count, where we hypothesized that the undercount might be even greater than they were in the first 5 neighborhoods, and primarily because you have higher rates of vacancy and more turnover and lower response rates to the census, meaning that you need more need for enumerators to go out and follow up on people who didn't respond on their own. And I will show you those results in a moment and show you that we actually did confirm that hypothesis, that the undercount was slightly higher in that next set of 5 neighborhoods. I want to make one other point of distinction here on this slide, which is that in the first set of 5 neighborhoods, we have data from the United States Postal Service and data from the Wayne State Canvass. We only canvassed those 5 areas. The next 5, we're relying on data from the Postal Service only to do our audit. And I'll show you that in the neighborhoods where we did both the Postal Service audit and the Canvass audit, those 2 numbers line up very closely with each other. So we were comfortable using the Postal Service data for the next set of 5 neighborhoods. Now here is where these 5 neighborhoods are located. The ones in gold are the first set of residentially stable neighborhoods. And just kind of looking across the screen, if I can get my pointer to work, we have Bagley, Green Acres, East English Village, Jefferson Chalmers, and then I forgot to mention Boston Edison right in the middle there. Those were those areas, like I said a moment ago, where the vacancy rate was anomalously high, is historically very low, and where we expect those to be relatively easy to count areas, and they're stable residential places. The next set of 5 neighborhoods were the ones where we expected the conditions might be more ripe for an undercount because they had lower response rates to the census, higher rates of vacancy, and other things. And they include Dexter Linwood, Virginia Park, Island View, Franklin, and LaSalle College Park. So I'm going to start by showing you the results from the gold neighborhoods, where we can line up the census along with the Wayne State Canvass and the Postal Service data. And then I'm going to put the whole package together for you and show you the results for all 10 neighborhoods. Oh, but first, a few details about the canvassing procedure. And we have Ramona Rodriguez-Washington here, who has even more detail than I do because she supervised this wonderful operation. But we had a team of canvassers going out at multiple times during the day. They counted roughly 3,000 housing units and made classifications on each one of those housing units about the type of housing that it was, single family, detached, attached, multifamily housing, et cetera. And really importantly, whether it was occupied or vacant. And they used many different indicators to determine that, including the presence of decorations, smoke in a chimney or from heaters. They went back at night if there was ambiguity to see if lights were on, were window treatments up, was there any mail on the porch or in the mailbox? Ramona can talk about more of the details, but it was really very carefully done counting and determination of whether this was an occupied unit or not. So we have a lot of confidence in that data. So here's the initial set of results. So I'm going to just kind of go through one by one, starting with Boston Edison. The blue bar here is representing the census count, or in this case, it's actually a rate of occupied housing. So the y-axis is on a percentage scale, and it represents the percentage of housing units in the one block group that we studied in Boston Edison that are occupied as opposed to vacant. So we see that roughly the census is saying that about 85% of the housing units in Boston Edison were occupied. If you think of it in terms of vacancy, you just flip it around, it would be about a 15% vacancy rate. And this was one of those neighborhoods that raised a red flag. Like, people didn't think Boston Edison would have a 15% vacancy rate. And sure enough, when we went out into the field, and this is the orange bar, and counted the housing and classified it as occupied, we found 95% of the houses in Boston Edison were occupied. And the Postal Service data, and I should mention, the other reason that we use the Postal Service data to kind of triage this and have a comparison of all 3 is that one limitation of the canvas is that it's contemporaneous. It happened in October. We don't have a time machine where we can go back and canvass the neighborhoods at the same time that the census was taking place in 2000. But we can do that with the Postal Service data, and we did do that with the Postal Service data. So the fact that the Postal Service data lines up so closely with what we're seeing on the ground right now, and that both of them are different from what the census showed, really made us say, we think we really have something here. And as you see, for the next neighborhood, which is Green Acres, very similar story. East English Village, almost identical between the Postal Service data and the canvas, and they're different from the census. Jefferson Chalmers, we see one of the biggest discrepancies, where you have just over 95% occupied according to the canvas, 91% according to the Postal the census only got 83%. And Ramona has stories about like what might have happened when the census went out in each one of these areas that really ground this in reality. And then finally, Bagley, where you see a similar story. So this is the result of the audit of these first 5 neighborhoods that were residentially stable. And I also said I would then put it together for you and show the next 5 and put it and show you them all. So here's a table that shows all 10 neighborhoods that we canvassed. The first 5 are the ones that you just saw: Boston, Edison, Green Acres, East English Village, Jefferson, Chalmers, and Bagley. The next 5 are the ones where we didn't do an on-the-ground canvass, but we did look at the Postal Service data. And what's on this chart is a methodology that we used to come up with a percent undercount measure. So the first column is what the number of housing units, of occupied housing units, counted in the 2020 census. We compared that to the number of occupied housing units we counted from the United States Postal Service data from June of 2020. And then we took the difference between those two and converted it to a percentage. And when you add up all of this, you see in these 10 areas, the census counted 4,300 housing units. The Postal Service counted over 4,700 housing units. That was a difference of 384 housing units. That translates into the 8.1% undercount of housing units. In the report, we also show how we can extrapolate this to the population, and we come up with a very similar estimate. About 8% of the population of these areas we estimate was undercounted. Okay, so now zooming out for just a second and going back to some of the findings that I told you about at the beginning, this is kind of where we began our work. This is that graph that I was showing you that made us really surprised to see how anomalous that decline in Detroit's population was in the 2020 census. Because prior to that, between the years like 2011 and up to 2016, there was a population decline in Detroit for sure, and it was happening at an average rate of about 1% per year. Then you see after 2016, from 2016 to 2019, there's a substantial flattening out of that curve. And the rate of population decline was basically cut in half. It went down to a little under 0.5% a year. So the fact that we see a 5% decline 2019 to 2020, as I said before, strikes us as implausible, and it made us want to see how other cities fared on this same dimension. So the next slide is going to show you that. What we have here is we're counting the percentage of the population counted in the 2020 census as a percentage of the prior year's estimate. So it's how big a percentage of the 2019 population estimate was the 2020 census count. And Detroit's was low. It was just over 95%. That's what I said was about a 5% drop in its population. And you see, and we have a fuller version of this graph in the report. We just couldn't fit all the cities on a slide, but there's more in the report. But we have a combination of cities that have comparable population sizes. I think we pulled like the 50 top population size cities, and then also cities in the Midwest that are more geographic comparisons to Detroit. And the only real comparisons here are San Antonio, Miami, and Phoenix. And you notice about those cities are that one of the fears heading into the 2020 census was the chilling effect that the possibility of a citizenship question on the 2020 census might have, particularly on foreign-born and Latino populations. And those are all cities that have a lot of foreign-born and Latino population. I think that I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but I think Miami is like 60% foreign-born and Detroit is about 6% foreign-born. So that does not apply to, that story, that narrative does not explain the population drop in Detroit. When you look at other cities that have comparable population sizes, just looking up here, Nashville was actually counted at a higher rate. They have a population gain in the 2020 census. We also have cities like Baltimore, Atlanta, Memphis, Boston. These are in the neighborhood of population sizes, but they don't have the same kind of drop in population size from 2019 to 2020 that Detroit had. And on the next slide, what I'm going to show you is that if you look at that decline, it's even more sharp if you measure the decline in terms of housing instead of people. That the number of housing units being counted in Detroit declined by about, I think it's 14% between 2019 and 2020. And as I said at the beginning, the miscounting housing is like, that's the backbone of everything else that follows in the census, and especially for the annual population estimates. And that's what really struck us, to focus on the housing story and to verify that this was happening, and to see, to see evidence of it on the ground. Okay, so I'm going to just sum up now and hand it off to the mayor, but I'm just going to reiterate the points I made at the beginning. The first point I want to make sure I leave you with is that the results of our audit study from the canvassing efforts and from the comparison to the Postal Service data showed that we estimate an 8% undercount in those areas that we studied most intensively in Detroit, those 10 neighborhoods. When we compare this to other cities, we don't really see anything that was comparable to Detroit. Detroit is an outlier nationally and also regionally in terms of the Midwest. And then finally, when you put this all together, this offers really compelling evidence, as Luke said at the outset, that there likely was an undercount in Detroit, and that if more research is needed to kind of pin down exactly how large that undercount is, but it could be quite substantial in terms of magnitude. It could be in the tens of thousands of people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the mayor to talk about next steps.
I want to thank Professor Mornoff for the outstanding study, and Luke Schaefer and the University of Michigan team, the Wayne State team, Kurt Metzger. We wanted to come at this with academic data to prove what happened. And what Professor Mornoff's analysis shows is that the U.S. government has inflicted an inequity of monumental proportion on the people of the city of Detroit. All we want as Detroiters is to be counted. They had one job, and they missed by a huge number. They have estimated we're at 639,000, and if you look at Professor Mornoff's study, which matches DTE's data, the city of Detroit has got 700,000 people. And the magnitude of that miss is almost beyond belief, and you're going to get a chance to hear from a couple folks who are going to explain why. I want to break down the process a little bit. And so which way does this go? The arrows on the keyboard. All right. So as some of you know, when I was a student at the University of Michigan, I was an enumerator in the 1980 census. In some ways, things haven't changed a lot in the way the process works. But it works like this. Step one, the Census Bureau sends out forms to people, tells them to send them in. When I was an enumerator, you mailed them in. But this year, for the first time, you could do it by internet. Once you get through April, the houses that haven't sent them in goes into a process called non-response follow-up. You send the enumerators out, knock on doors. That's what I did in 1980 in the streets of Ann Arbor. I knocked on doors on the houses where they had not responded. And after you've knocked on the doors enough times and nobody's answered, you go to something called proxy. You can knock on the neighbors' doors and ask who lives in the house and fill it out. Now, as you can imagine, proxy isn't all that effective. When somebody in the government knocks on the door and wants to ask you about who's in the neighbor's house, that is not as good a way to get people to help you than when you talk to the homeowners themselves. But this same three-step process has not changed much in half a century, except one way, and it was a way that hurt the city of Detroit. Because this year, for the first time, you could respond by internet. And so they sent the forms out by internet, and you could answer by internet. And there was no question, there were red flags raised immediately, that the communities in this country who were less likely to have a computer or be that sophisticated were going to have a lower response. It was given. If you look at 51% non-response, the city of Detroit had the lowest response rate in America. I could have predicted that to you before they sent them out. That's okay. That kicks you into the non-response follow-up, which is where the hard work of the census has been done since the beginning of this country, except it wasn't done that way with any diligence in the city of Detroit. So The Census Bureau knew around May or June, Detroit had the highest non-response rate in the country. They had to go do the follow-up. Here's from the Census Bureau handbook, not any different than it was 40 years ago. This is what you tell your census managers to do in non-response follow-ups. A quote right out of the handbook. The default number of contact attempts for a non-responsive follow-up case is 6. That means that you are instructed to knock on that door 6 times, different times of the day and night, to find out who's there. After not getting a response 6 times, you can go to a proxy and you try 3 neighbors to try to see if somebody will tell you. If you're really jammed for time, you can get by with 3 knocks on the original door before you go to proxies. As we're going to show you in the city of Detroit, and you're going to hear from the folks who are doing it, they didn't go to the doors in this city 6 times. They didn't even go to the doors in this city 3 times. The Census Bureau violated its own policies in the city of Detroit, failed to go out and do the follow-up, went to proxies way too quickly, and it is no surprise that the result is exactly what we have. What the University of Michigan has just shown you is an 8% undercount. The terrible part about it is this was malpractice by the Census Bureau. This was not an honest mistake. So what happened? In September of 2020, across the country, with COVID and the introduction of the internet, everybody knew that the follow-up needed more time. In fact, the census officials themselves, many of the senior management said, we need more time, we haven't gotten out to the follow-up. And the Court of Appeals told them you need to go back and take more time. This defines a city's future for the next decade. You have to get the count right. And the Trump administration tried to shut the counts down. And here's the other thing that we've heard from witnesses and we will show in court if we get there. When the non-response follow-up started in the state of Michigan, even though the Census Bureau knew Detroit had the highest non-response rate in America, they sent the follow-up efforts to the outstate and suburban areas first. They got to Detroit last. You should have sent your resources in where it was highest. They went just the opposite. They covered the outlying areas of the state first, and then the administration said, we're going to shut off the census early. They hadn't gotten down here. They knew full well they hadn't gotten down here. But at least the Court of Appeals said, you need to finish the job and get this count right. Unfortunately, we had this kind of issue. I'm going to let 2 of the workers tell you about this, that they go to a house 1 time, and that was it. That was all they had time for. They were sent out so late with so little information and so little time that they were told not even to follow the standard process. And so finally in October of 2020, I was raising hell publicly, as you may remember, about what was going on. They started to move people from the suburbs down into the city to do a proper non-response follow-up. And just as they did that, the Supreme Court stepped in and said the Trump administration can terminate the census early. And that was it. They wrapped up without getting here thoroughly. And some of you were in the room when Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and I stood up last October and we said then, here's what happened. They did not get the non-response follow-up in the city of Detroit. We are going to be undercounted. This is before I saw any numbers. I knew that the fact they had not gotten down here was inevitably going to lead to an undercount. And so if you look at the University of Michigan analysis, this just boggles my mind. Any of you can do this. So the Census Bureau gives us the number of occupied houses by block. So you go out to Boston, Edison, 84% occupancy. That means 1 out of 6 houses in Boston, Edison is vacant by the Census Bureau's count. I would invite any reporter in this room to go into Boston, Edison and see if you think 1 out of 6 houses is vacant. It's absurd. But here's the crazier part. The U.S. Postal Service has a process. But when a house goes vacant, the postal carriers record it as vacant so they don't have to keep going back to the house. So the Postal Service always has an up-to-date listing of what houses are occupied and what houses are vacant. And the U.S. Postal Service, which is the orange line, that orange bar in Boston Edison, says the houses are 94% occupied. Now think about this. Instead of spending billions of dollars on their census count, if the census worker had just followed the postman down the street, they would have found a lot more houses occupied than they found in their process. The incompetence here is beyond belief. And here is the thing that the University of Michigan study shows. They took 5 samples out of the gate. We didn't know. Was the Census Bureau high in one neighborhood, low in one neighborhood? Was the U of M, Wayne State effort high in one neighborhood, low in one neighborhood? The same pattern in every single neighborhood, that the Census Bureau missed large numbers of vacant houses that the post office knew about and missed large numbers of vacant houses that we found when the University of Michigan and Wayne State went out door to door. So you say, how can this happen? It's really simple. Census count is about being diligent in knocking on doors. And in my lifetime, the Census Bureau always tried to get an honest count, whether it was Republican or Democratic. This is the first time I have ever seen an effort in which there was, I believe, an intentional decision not to count Detroit thoroughly. But I'm going to get you a chance to hear from 2 of the workers who went to work for the Census Bureau. Clois Foster and Brenda Jett are going to come up and talk to you. They went to work for the Census Bureau because they wanted to get the count right in Detroit. They cared about the city. And they were federal government employees working for the U.S. Census Bureau. And I'm going to ask the 2 of them to come up and tell their stories, and you'll start to understand why I'm so angry and why we're appealing. And so I'd ask Ms. Foster, Ms. Jett, if you'd come up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hello, everyone. My name is Clois Foster. I am a retired postal worker. I also was a census captain with the city, but I also was hired by the government for the Census Bureau for 2020. When I got hired in 2019 of August of October of 2019, but I didn't start work until August of 2020. It was very frustrating. They were unorganized. When I got my phone, I had somebody else's ID. And the problem that I really had was the proxies. I was doing proxies right away. As the mayor said, it was supposed to take 6 times, but I was doing proxies after 1 time. Sometimes I would talk to my supervisor and tell her, oh, they got the proxy for this house. And she said, well, you have to do it. So when I go out and I have to do a proxy, and if no one's around, I have to guess. So that's not an accurate count. I have to guess how many people in the house, who lives in the house. So what I do, I look and see what's outside, if there's any toys outside or anything like that. But guessing is not accurate. So I was doing a lot of guessing as far as a proxy, trying to get a good count. So, but that's not a good count, guessing. Also, I knew that we wasn't finished in Detroit, but they were sending me out to Westland, Inkster, Wayne, to get a count. But I knew Detroit wasn't finished. We needed more. So it was just frustrating. It was just so frustrating because I care about Detroit. I care about my city. I'm 66 years old. I've been living here all my life. And if we don't get this right, we don't get what we need. So my problem was the proxies. Guessing, not getting an accurate count, and waiting too long to get, I would have 100 cases at one time. Then on down the line, I would get 15 cases. They even asked me to go out of state. How can I go out of state in my own city? It's not being counted. So these were the problems I was having, just trying to get an accurate count, had to guess all the time. Your neighbors don't want to talk about the neighbors. So it's really hard to get an accurate count when you're out there trying to do the census. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Brenda Jett. I am a retired Detroit public school teacher. I too was a census captain for the city before I became an official 2020 census enumerator for the U.S. government. I got involved in this, I guess, because of family. My mother, my grandmother, and my stepfather all took school census for years when you had to write everything out by hand. Now, I can appreciate not having to do that, having watched them year after year. But let me tell you, if you've ever tried to fill out a form on a computer, and we were using little phones. We had iPhones, not as big as this phone. We had iPhone 8s that we had to use. You had to do exactly what it said. So as Clovis was saying, when you got to a house and you went up, no answer, if it said get a proxy, that's what you had to do. And when you went to one house, okay, no answer. We'll go somewhere else. And you'd have to go to 3 different ones that day. You weren't waiting like 5 or 6 times, as the mayor was pointing out. That same day, you were going to 3 other places trying to find somebody, anybody, who would help you to determine whether or not that dwelling was occupied. But I tell you what was most frustrating, I spent an inordinate amount of time proxying vacant lots. As big as this room is, count it 3 or 4 times, you know, a whole block, grass, no houses, but I was expected to ask somebody, anybody, was there a house there on Census Day in April? And I had one man look at me like I had lost my mind, and he's saying, you see all that grass? No. There was nobody there in April. There hasn't been anybody there in 10 years. I even tried to proxy certain properties myself because for all of, at that point, 74 years, I lived in the same area. I knew that there had not been a house on that property for years. But the little phone would not even accept what I said sometimes. It would still send me back to that same place, like there would be a miraculous home that appeared in the interim. And this was crazy because at the same time, you're getting messages on your phone that say, ooh, bonus, $300, $500 if you go to Indiana, let's say. And you're thinking, what? There are days when I don't even get work here, but I can see that everything is not done. And then for the very last 5 days after they went back and forth about when it was going to end, I got no work. I was told the database was frozen. Now, I had a wonderful, wonderful field supervisor, but there was nothing she could do about a frozen database. And then somebody trying to whisk me off to another state when there was work to be done here. And it was just so unfortunate because we've got a great city and we've got wonderful people. But sometimes fighting the system gets to be very difficult. And I really hope that something that is said here, something that has been done by this wonderful team will make a difference because we've been grossly undercounted and we really need every dollar. There are so many services that come our way because of the census. It's not just something that you get that one year. It goes on for 10, 15 years, some of the things that we get, and it's important. So I really hope that we are making a difference. Thank you.
Okay, we are happy to take all of your questions. I know Professor Mornoff is hoping for at least one wonky question about methodology.
There is not a precedent in the country where there was an undercount done in such an intentional way. So we've got, I think, an unprecedented situation. There also has not been a case where you got an independent university come in and prove the Census Bureau was wrong. So we're going to have a 2-step process. We're going to appeal to the Commerce Department. They know it's coming. And Hopefully, they will have a means to correct it. And if they don't, we're going to go to federal court, and we got a strong case. But my hope is that the Commerce Department will analyze the data from the University of Michigan study, realize it was a huge undercount, and remedy this quickly.
Mayor, beyond the economic ramifications that have been brought up, when you talk about your view of this being intentional, do you see this as a deliberate undercutting of a minority community in the political environment we just experienced last year? Do you hope with the new administration and that this can be revisited and adjusted?
So when you hear from the two enumerators who had huge numbers of houses in Detroit where they had never gotten to, and they're getting bonuses to go to Indiana, there's really only one implication. It was not the priority of the Census Bureau to count the city of Detroit. And I think we're not going to have any trouble proving that. And so that's certainly a big part of our case. And we're going to see. Commerce is well aware this appeal is coming, and they're well aware that if they don't address it, we're going to go to federal court, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to give Commerce a fair chance. I know our congressional delegation, I anticipate, will be having some significant hearings on the practices here. And we need to make sure this doesn't happen in America again. There is a standard for 6 follow-up visits to a house for a reason. There are daily records of non-response follow-up rates in every city in this country. It isn't that hard to target your enumerators to the communities with the highest non-response rate. It's not that hard. They chose not to do it here, and I think that's going to be very hard for them to defend.
I have 2 questions. One for you, Mayor. In your line of work and your experience, do you believe that something like this was done on purpose? And my second question is for Mayor.
Well, sorry. I guess I would draw a boundary there as an academic who has not studied the intentionality of this. I'm a little bit cautious about making that kind of interpretation about whether it was done on purpose. I do think it's egregious, though. I think that's what I can say with confidence is that the numbers are far enough off that this did not happen by chance. But I will leave it to the mayor and his team to who know more about the facts on the ground to explain how this may have happened.
So, Mayor, my second question, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked him, but do you believe this was done hands down on purpose?
I think that the Census Bureau prioritized non-Detroit areas and then, without any doubt, ended the census early. Really appealing from the Court of Appeals order telling them to keep going. They went to the Supreme Court in order to end the census count early. Their senior staff people were saying we're not done, we don't have this count right, and yet they ended it early. I don't know what other conclusion you can draw.
And my second question, and I know you mentioned the appeal, will there be another round of people going door to door to make sure these numbers are accurate, or how does that door to door?
Oh, I think right now we sampled 5 neighborhoods door to door, 5 neighborhoods with Postal Service comparison, and in every single one the pattern was the same. If you had different patterns in different parts of the city, you need to do more. We're going to go to the Commerce Department, see what they say, and we'll respond from there as to what they want additional. I have no doubt. Think about this. Boston Edison is about the easiest neighborhood. Green Acres, about the easiest neighborhood in this city to count. It's large home ownership. People are there. Can you imagine when you went into areas with apartments and rentals and more transient residents? That's normally in this country where the count is the hardest. What U of M showed is they missed in the easiest areas. I suspect if we got into the transient areas, the undercount is going to be even greater than what's showing here.
Mayor, is this process with the Commerce Department, so that's separate from what the Census Bureau does to allow for the review that's supposed to start in 2022? Is
No.
there a difference there, and what would the outcome be of this attempt to get the number corrected? Does that mean, obviously it's too late for the redistricting process, but what would the impact there?
There is a huge amount of funding to every city in this country that is based upon the annual census estimate, what Professor Mornoff was showing you that suddenly dropped 5%. And So certainly at a minimum, we want it fixed in '22 going forward. And then whether we can do anything about the boundaries and the underrepresentation in the legislature is another question. And both of those things we're going to pursue, but certainly the underfunding starting in 2022 is going to be the minimum I expect to get fixed.
Just for my own knowledge, was this separate from this process of the census?
We don't know. So we're going up through Commerce in their process, and whether it goes through the normal process or whether they handle it in another review, we don't know. Commerce knows this appeal is coming, and we are going to wait and see what process that they use, but we're going to give the Commerce Department the chance to fix this first. I don't especially want to be suing the federal government. I'd like them to do the right thing, and given this administration's commitment to equity and fairness, I just can't imagine they won't correct a terrible injustice.
Is there an estimate dollar amount?
It's huge. I didn't put numbers to it, but it's, you know, it's a huge amount of money. I mean, everything from healthcare funds to hot lunch funds to the school districts. You go right down the line. There's a huge amount of funding that flows into the Detroit area based on the census count. It affects a lot of services in a lot of different areas. Oh, it'd be tens of millions. Okay, well, the professor, maybe. Okay.
The federal government disperses $1.5 billion a year to states and local municipalities on the basis of data linked to the census count. And that works out to be somewhere in excess of $5,000 per person per Michigan resident. It's not directly on the census count. It depends on characteristics, areas with higher poverty rates, unemployment rates, and so on. It's a substantial $1.5 billion every year dispersed the basis of census-derived information.
Do we have any way of knowing the racial makeup of the undercounted population, the age, the gender? Is there any way to that?
Yeah, so the question was about how the undercount breaks down by race, and we haven't done an extensive enough study of the neighborhoods in the city to give you results on how it varies by the racial composition of the neighborhood. I can, however, point you to other research that's been done at the Urban Institute especially that shows that places with higher populations of color are more likely to be undercounted, as are poor places. And as the mayor said, you know, there's at least a hypothesis that if we extended this methodology to other places, we might find even higher rates of undercount than we found here. But I can't give you a definitive answer because we haven't done enough study yet.
Why don't we ask Ramona Rodriguez-Washington, who was out door to door and found the undercounted houses, what she observed. She probably has some insight into that.
Thank you. Wayne State, with about 11 staff members, actually got the data. Yep. Yep. Wayne State University received the database of all household units from the city of Detroit approximately the first week of October. And what we did with the database of all household units is we created a tracking database and mapped it in walking maps. So about 11 staff members went door to door, and they had to canvass in the morning. And we did a little background search. We contacted, like over in Jefferson East, we said, Josh, can you send out a notification to your residents that we'll be in this particular neighborhood? We looked at school startup times because kids go to school at the same time every day. So we did a little bit of research at how to best target the neighborhood. And in Jefferson East on October 25th, it just so happened to rain very heavily, and people were putting things outside once again. So our team went door to door with this database of every address. And if there was no answer, there was no immediate way, we followed up with the afternoon and a nighttime visit. If a Monday through Friday visit didn't give us a disposition whether it was occupied or unoccupied, we followed up with a Saturday or a Sunday visit, also at AM, afternoon, and at nighttime. And so every household didn't leave the tracking database for households until there was a final disposition. But every night after we came in, there was a field supervisor that was driving behind the walking teams who audited the data, took a few pictures here and there to see, does this match what my picture on my cell phone says? And so they audited the data, and if the findings weren't similar, the address went back out into the database to be revisited again. So in about 2 weeks, the team wrapped it up, and we visited about 3,000 houses, but I'd like to say it's close to 12,000 with the amount of hours, intensity, and time we had to invest.
Question in the corner here.
Hey, thank you. Brandon Hudson, Fox 2, how you doing? My question for Mayor Mike. You know, once this news hits, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to come out and say, see, I told you the government doesn't really care about us. So what are you going to do? And I see that Ms. Fox is shaking her head over there. But what are you going to do to get a lot of these people to have their trust restored in the government, in the census to begin with?
Well, I think the people of Detroit did our part in making sure the government changed so we could trust it. And now we expect that the administration treat us fairly. So I'm going up with a positive attitude. Everybody knows what my relationship is with the president, but the president isn't going to reverse census numbers because I complain. The appeal had to be based on objective documentation, which is why I went to the University of Michigan and Wayne State. I think we've got irrefutable documentation now. And so we're going to keep fighting until we succeed, and I know the administration is waiting to see the objective evidence to back my claims.
Are you seeking, would you seek a revision of these numbers, or are you looking at this that you're not going to overturn a census until 2030?
Oh no, well, we expect a revision. We didn't go through all this for no purpose. They spent all those thousands of hours out there because we expect the federal government to correct a wrong here.
Which would involve what in your estimation?
Yeah.
Recanvassing?
So the Commerce Department rules on census appeals are pretty arcane. So I'm not going to predict what the process is going to be. What I know for sure is that every decade you have some elected officials complain they were undercounted. I'm not aware of a case, and I should thank Bloomberg Associates who helped us in this process. I'm not aware of a case where a city went and got a university to do an independent study, which then concluded there was a huge miss. And so we're in a situation the Census Bureau hasn't seen, and we'll see how it plays out. Obviously, I'm going to argue very hard.
Two more quick ones, please. The 2019 estimate of 670,000, you cited DTE around 7.
Right.
Sitting here today, how many people do you think live in the city?
Oh, I think 700,000 is really what's living here, and I think the federal government managed to count 9 out of 10.
Lastly, I'd like your thought in regard to if this would impact state electoral college vote total for Michigan as well as representation on a congressional level.
You know, I haven't looked at that. I don't know that this number of people would have affected the allocation of congressional seats, so I just haven't looked at that.
Mayor, have you talked to the president about this? Sure.
Preliminarily, I did, but I've talked to everybody at the federal government, and they all said the same thing. Bring us facts, okay? We can act on facts. We can't act on your complaints. And if I were them, I'd say exactly the same thing, bring us facts. So today we are releasing the University of Michigan study, and we have the facts. And I think when the Census Bureau sees these facts, they're really indisputable. I mean, I'll be glad to walk up down the same streets in Boston, Edison, and say, you show me the 1 out of 6 houses that are vacant, and by the way, the postman just delivered to the family there that you said doesn't live there. That's a conversation I'm looking forward to having. Anything else?
I guess I'd like to also just highlight again that a lot of this money goes to help underserved communities, it goes to help people who are economically challenged. So it seems like you're kind of highlighting a civil rights component.
Well, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. And so the people of the city of Detroit are not being treated fairly. All I want, I don't want any special treatment. I just want our residents to be counted, which is the same thing everybody should want. And I suspect the people in the suburbs completely agree with me. All we want is a fair and accurate count, and now I think we have the tools to go get it.
Why do you think Detroit was singled out among all of these other big metro areas with diverse populations?
You know, I'm going to. There are other cities who are starting to go down this road, but as Professor showed, the drop in Detroit was the steepest, and my guess is that they overallocated the resources to the other areas until it was too late. But if we get into litigation, you know, we'll actually find out exactly how it happened. But you know, I got the workers here. They would tell you it was haphazard. We had people the last time we did this who said, I worked in Sterling Heights, I got my full list of houses first thing in the morning, I spent the day efficiently. When I came down to Detroit at the end, I sat around till 4 o'clock. Finally, I got some houses, they weren't there. The level of professionalism in the conduct of the census in the outlying areas in Detroit was very different. And I think you saw that, right? And that's something we're going to make an issue of. All right, thank you all very much for being here. All right, you're great.
We have been on Zoom, haven't we?